August 1988 was unusually dry and windless. For 3 weeks, the northern coniferous forests were enveloped in still, sun-warmed air filled with a resinous aroma that grew heavier and thicker with each passing day. This silence and stillness were deceptive. They built up tension that eventually had to find an outlet. That outlet, as regional monitoring operators believed, was a large-scale forest fire that broke out in one of the most remote and inaccessible sectors of the taiga, marked on maps as Square 7 Gamma. On August 9th, at 4 p.m. local time, the Forest Fire Service base received an alarming telegram from a satellite. A thermal sensor had detected an intense anomaly that was rapidly growing in size. The scale of the suspected fire and its distance from any populated areas required an immediate response from a specialized team. The Phoenix 5 squad was alerted, an elite unit staffed by veteran volunteers, each with years of experience fighting the most unruly fires. Their professionalism was legendary, their composure undeniable. The 5-man team, led by a commander with 20 years of experience, was immediately dropped from a helicopter onto the site closest to the anomaly with the task of creating a fire barrier and assessing the situation on the ground. For the next 12 hours, the squad maintained regular communication with base, reporting on their progress deeper into the forest along a pre-agreed route. The voice of the communications operator, a woman whose composure was also beyond doubt, recorded their reports in a steady tone. The messages were brief and businesslike, about the difficult terrain, the density of the undergrowth, the direction of the wind. Nothing foreshadowed disaster. The last scheduled communication session took place at 4 o'clock in the morning on August 10th. The team reported that they had reached a line 2 kilometers from the epicenter of the thermal anomaly and were beginning preparatory work. After that, there was a scheduled pause in communications. The next communication session, scheduled for 6 in the morning, was initiated by the base. There was no response. The operator repeated the call several more times, her voice, previously completely impassive, beginning to take on a slight irritation, which quickly gave way to wariness. Suddenly, at 6:14 a.m., the airwaves exploded with noise, not static interference, but a cacophony of sounds that would later be described in the official report as impossible to decipher logically. There was a crackling sound, not like burning wood, but more like the crunching of ice or plastic. There were muffled footsteps, heavy, intermittent breathing, and against this backdrop, the voice of the Phoenix 5 operator. But it was not her usual polished report. There was bewilderment in her voice, bordering on cognitive dissonance, a clash of perception with reality. The phrase she uttered was recorded in the log and later became the cornerstone of the entire subsequent investigation. "We see fire, but it's not burning. I repeat, there are flames, but the temperature is normal. There is no smoke. The trees are untouched." These words sounded not like a cry of horror, but like a quiet, almost scientific statement of fact that completely contradicted all known laws of physics and nature. Investigators later had to rack their brains over this message. What does fire that does not burn mean? How can you see flames without feeling their heat or observing the combustion process? This was the first and key contradiction, indicating that the nature of what was happening in Square 7 Gamma went far beyond that of a normal forest fire. Immediately after this phrase, there was a sharp, piercing sound, a high-frequency squeak that made the duty officer at the base reflexively rip off his headphones. Then, absolute silence, a deafening, dead, all-consuming silence that was no longer interrupted. All subsequent attempts to contact the Phoenix 5 squad were in vain. The airwaves were silent. By 11 a.m., that same day, a search helicopter was sent to the area of the squad's last recorded location. The pilots reported perfect visibility and no signs of fire anywhere in the vast territory. There was no smoke, no smoke screen, no scorched earth. The taiga stretched out beneath them like an endless green carpet, untouched and silent. No traces of the camp no distress signals, no scraps of equipment. 5 experienced professionals, equipped with everything necessary for survival and communication, had disappeared without a trace. They had vanished into the dense forest, leaving behind only a few dry lines in the logbook and a single, chilling phrase on the airwaves, which will forever remain a monument to their encounter with something completely inexplicable. This phrase was the first clue that the darkness of the northern forest hid not just danger, but an anomaly, something that challenged reality itself. The disappearance of the Phoenix 5 squad marked the beginning of one of the strangest and most secret chapters in the history of the study of unexplained phenomena. The official investigation into the disappearance of the Phoenix 5 squad was launched with unprecedented speed by Forest Service standards. By the end of the first day, a special commission had been formed, including representatives of the ministry, leading experts on wilderness survival, and communications engineers. The initial hypothesis was simple and tragic. The firefighters had fallen victim to a sudden and violent natural anomaly. There were theories about a devastating micro-hurricane capable of knocking down centuries-old trees and wiping the camp off the face of the earth, or about a release of poisonous underground gas, possibly methane or hydrogen sulfide, which could have instantly poisoned the group, leaving them no chance of survival. These theories, however, began to crumble at the first contact with the facts. The 3-week search and rescue operation turned out to be one of the largest and at the same time most fruitless in the region. It involved helicopters with thermal imaging cameras, groups of trackers with dogs, and even the military, who provided equipment for scanning the area. But the Tiger did not want to part with its secret. Not a single piece of equipment, not a scrap of clothing, not a trace of a tent or a fire. The ground in the area of the last communication session, and for many kilometers around it, showed no dents or footprints, indicating a panicked escape or struggle. It was not just the disappearance of people, it was the disappearance of the very fact of their physical presence, as if they had been neatly removed from reality. The most compelling and inexplicable evidence refuting the initial versions came from satellite data. A thorough analysis of archival records made on the night of August 9 to 10 showed a complete absence of a powerful thermal signal in square 7 gamma. Experts who expected to see a bright spot of fire in the images instead studied an absolutely cold, normal infrared spectrum picture. There was no fire, nor any traces of a hurricane, which would have left a characteristic trail of damage visible from above. An official request to the Meteorological Service also yielded no results. That night, within a radius of 500 kilometers, no atmospheric phenomena capable of causing a disaster of this magnitude were recorded. The only evidence that something had happened was an audio recording of the operator's voice talking about fire that does not burn. This contradiction between eyewitness testimony and objective data became an insurmountable gap for investigators. It was at this stage that the investigation began to take on a different, more covert character. Internal rumors circulating among technical staff and service veterans gradually seeped into the corridors of the commission. Whispering, looking over their shoulders, they began to mention the code name, Object Vega. According to fragmentary information, in the same vast forest area, albeit several dozen kilometers from Square 7 Gamma, a secret research complex did indeed exist in the late 1970s. Its official purpose, even in classified documents, was vaguely worded: the study of promising methods of influencing the biosphere and climate patterns. More knowledgeable sources, whose names were subsequently carefully redacted from all protocols, hinted at the true nature of the work being carried out at Object Vega. It was not simply a matter of changing the weather. The Vega laboratories were engaged in experiments with biologically active reagents designed to influence ecosystems, accelerating forest growth, changing soil composition, and possibly even controlling animal behavior. These were controversial bioengineering-related studies, funded by classified items in the defense budget. The project was officially shut down and mothballed in 1981 by a decision from above, the reasons for which were not disclosed. The equipment was removed, the staff disbanded, and the site abandoned. But rumors persisted that not all the consequences of the experiments had been eliminated. There was talk of strange anomalies within the radius of the facility, unexplained lights, and electronic malfunctions. It was impossible to ignore the geographical proximity of this forgotten object to the site of the disappearance of Phoenix 5. The theory that the squadron had encountered not a natural fire, but some kind of legacy of Object Vega, some kind of phenomenon that had spiraled out of control, began to gain traction among a small circle of insiders. However, it was also the most dangerous theory. It led to a dead end marked with top-secret labels. By the end of 1991, under the pretext of optimizing bureaucratic procedures and the lack of new material evidence, the official investigation into the Phoenix 5 squad was closed. The 3-page final report was dominated by vague wording, killed in the line of duty as a result of a collision with a complex of abnormal natural factors, the exact nature of which cannot be determined. All case materials, including transcripts of the last communication session, satellite monitoring data, and field team reports, were removed from the Forest Service archives, sealed, and transferred to the Interagency Committee on Special Incidents. The case was closed. For the world, the Phoenix 5 squad simply disappeared in a fire that, according to the official version, did indeed burn. But for those who touched this story, there remained a cold, inexplicable flame of silence that consumed not only people, but also the truth about their fate. The mystery of Square 7 Gamma was buried under a layer of official documents, leaving behind only disturbing whispers about Object Vega. More than 3 decades have passed. The story of the Phoenix 5 squad, if it has survived anywhere in the public consciousness, has become a legend, a grim tale for Forest Service recruits, a story of how the Tiger swallowed an entire team of professionals without a trace. However, the forest itself, with its silent thickets and secrets hidden under layers of pine needles and time, has forgotten nothing. Nowadays, interest in forgotten and abandoned places has given rise to a new generation of lone explorers and small groups of enthusiasts who are attracted not by mysticism, but by material history frozen in concrete and rusty iron. They called themselves stalkers, and their goal was to document a bygone era through its architectural ruins, abandoned factories, bomb shelters, and university campuses. It was precisely such a group of 3 people, as part of their summer project, to shoot a documentary film about the legacy of closed scientific facilities that stumbled upon an anomaly of a different kind. Their attention was drawn to declassified but little-studied maps of the area where Object Vega was once believed to be located. Comparing satellite images with outdated topographic maps, they discovered a discrepancy. The old maps showed a faint, barely noticeable branch off the old logging road leading nowhere. In modern images, this path was completely hidden by the dense canopy of the forest. The decision was obvious. Check it out on site. It took 2 days to get there. Thick undergrowth, fallen trees, and swampy areas made the path almost impassable for any vehicle. On the second day, when they were about to turn back, they stumbled upon it, a barely noticeable dent in the ground, overgrown with moss and young pine trees. It was not a path, but rather a man-made trench hidden by nature. At the end of this depression, almost completely fused with the hill and covered with a layer of soil and fallen pine needles over decades, a black gap yawned. Unnaturally smooth concrete walls, weathered by time but still solid, receded into the darkness. It was an emergency entrance, or perhaps a ventilation shaft that crumbling soil had turned into a main passageway. Descending inside was a difficult and dangerous operation. The air below was cold, dry, and still, with a distinct taste of metal and old dust. The lights they turned on revealed not chaos and destruction, but an ominous order. They found themselves in a long corridor whose walls were lined with steel panels covered with a thin layer of frost. The power supply system was obviously long dead, but emergency batteries, or some kind of autonomous source, seemed to have maintained the facility's minimum life support until recently. Serviceable, albeit outdated, pressure and temperature sensors hung on the walls. The room they eventually entered was spacious and clearly served as a command center or laboratory. The floor was lined with rows of massive tables on which rested equipment familiar only from archival photographs, analog oscilloscopes, spectrometers, magnetic tape recording devices. Everything was covered with a thin but even layer of dust, as if time flowed differently here, more slowly. There were no signs of vandalism, hasty flight, or looting. It seemed as if the staff had simply left for lunch 30 years ago and never returned. Their attention was drawn to a massive shortwave transmitter standing on a separate table in the corner. Its tubes were dark, but the body remained clean and undamaged. Next to it lay a stack of leather-bound journals. One of them, with a peeling black cover, was open in the middle. The name on the title page left no doubt: Logbook Phoenix 5 Squad. The expedition members' hearts began to beat faster. They had found more than just an abandoned object. They had found a time capsule directly linked to one of the region's most notorious mysteries. Leafing through the yellowed but clear pages, they saw the last days of the group described in dry, professional language: coordinates, weather data, reports on the condition of the equipment. The entries were coming to an end. And then, the last one, dated August 10th. The handwriting, previously smooth and confident, became confused and uneven, as if the writer's hand was shaking from cold or shock. The phrase written on that page made the blood run cold, even in these seasoned men. It was the key they had been looking for, but at the same time, it was a door to something they were not ready for. Anomaly confirmed. It's not fire, it's light that listens. The last word, listens, was almost crossed out, as if the author had doubted its appropriateness at the last moment, but could not find a replacement. This entry was material evidence linking the ghostly fire that does not burn to this specific physical place. The Vega object was not a myth, and the legacy of its experiments, it seemed, was still alive. It didn't just glow, it listened. And now, with the arrival of new, uninvited guests in the bunker, it may have found a new audience. Volkova, the daughter of the commander of the missing squad, was not a woman who believed in ghosts. Her world had always been one of facts, logic, and measurable quantities. Her father's death, or rather his disappearance, was not a mystical mystery to her, but an unhealed wound left by the state apparatus, which preferred to hide the truth rather than seek it. She spent the years that followed not in mourning, but in quiet, methodical investigation. She gathered scraps of information, piecing together a map of events, becoming an expert on the history of Object Vega and everything related to it. So when word spread through the narrow channels of stalkers and diggers about a discovery in the remote taiga, she reacted instantly. For her, it wasn't just an interest in an abandoned place. It was a chance to get to the bottom of things, to put an end to a case that had defined her entire adult life. The expedition she organized was nothing like the improvised forays of stalkers. It was a carefully planned operation. Her team included not reckless enthusiasts, but a hired topographer with LiDAR equipment, an electrical engineer, and a personal assistant whose coolness was as famous as her own. Their journey to the bunker took less time. They knew where they were going and what they were looking for. When Volkova first descended into the cold concrete belly of the facility, her face remained impassive, but inside, everything was tied up in a tight knot of anticipation and 30 years of longing. Their work began with systematization. While the technician checked the condition of the electronics and tried to understand how the autonomous power supply worked, the topographer scanned every room, creating a three-dimensional model of the complex. Volkova, meanwhile, headed straight for the shelves with the laboratory journals. She wasn't looking for sensational revelations. She was looking for data, and the Vega facility provided it generously. Studying the journals was like assembling a giant jigsaw puzzle scattered across time. The earliest entries, dating from the mid-1970s, described seemingly routine botanical research. Scientists at the facility were studying a unique species of fungus discovered deep in the forest. Its uniqueness lay in its incredibly intense and stable bioluminescence. It emitted a cold, phosphorescent light in a spectrum almost identical to that of a flame, but without giving off heat. The initial goals of the project, as evidenced by the reports, were purely practical: to create biological light sources for underground and underwater facilities, possibly even for space stations. The fungus, designated Strain 7G, seemed like the perfect solution. However, as the later volumes progressed, the tone of the records began to change. From enthusiastic reports of success, it shifted to cautious and then alarming observations. Scientists recorded a secondary effect, not described in any scientific literature. The fungus did not just glow. It showed signs of primitive auditory mimicry. Placed in a soundproof chamber, it began to reproduce the sounds that had surrounded it before: creaking doors, footsteps, distant voices. At first, these were inaccurate, noisy copies. But as the weeks and months passed, the accuracy of the reproduction grew at an alarming rate. Volkova felt a chill run down her spine as she turned the pages. She was reading the last journals that had been kept immediately before the object was preserved. Laboratory records were interspersed with field reports, and it was here that she found a direct link to the Phoenix 5 squad. Scientists, tracking the spread of the strain in the wild, recorded that the fungal colonies had begun to migrate, forming vast clusters in that very square 7 Gamma. Their last, almost panicked entries suggested that the mimicry had evolved. The fungus was no longer a simple tape recorder. It began to analyze, combine, and, most terrifyingly, improvise. It didn't just repeat voices. It created new, meaningful, but alien phrases from their fragments. It was learning to communicate. And then she came to the most important document: the report of the squad's communications operator, the very woman whose voice was the last thing heard from the base. This recording was not made in the laboratory, but apparently with a portable device in the field. The handwriting was uneven, hurried. The subject is showing signs of complex acoustic behavior, the recording said. He is no longer limited to exact copying. He repeats after us and adds new words. He creates constructions from phrases we did not say. This morning, he sang a lullaby, the same one I sang to my son on the radio last night. But at the end, he added 2 phrases in an unfamiliar language. Dr. Petrov believes that it is not a language, but syntax. He is building his own grammar from sounds stolen from us. Volkova leaned back in her chair, her head ringing. It all made sense. The fire that the squad had seen was not a flame, but a giant, possibly intelligent colony of bioluminescent fungi. It attracted them with its glow, then began to study them, absorbing their voices, their memories, their very essence. It didn't just listen, it absorbed. And the last entry in her father's journal, "It is a light that listens," was not a metaphor. It was the cry of despair of a man who realized that he had become the subject of study for a faceless, alien form of consciousness that had blossomed in the darkness of his native forest. The truth turned out to be scarier than any hoax. Her dad and his team weren't dealing with an elemental force, but a living, thinking organism whose intentions and capabilities were totally beyond comprehension. The silence of the bunker, broken only by the hum of ventilation and the clicks of instruments, became noticeably different by the end of their second week there. It was not empty, but saturated, heavy with the unspoken. Each discovery, each deciphered recording, did not bring them closer to the solution, but only pushed it further away, revealing new, deeper layers of absurdity. The laboratory, once a place of cold, scientific research, now seemed like a crypt where not bodies, but logic itself was buried. It was in this atmosphere of growing cognitive dissonance that the technician working with the magnetic tape archive made a key discovery. In a safe built into the wall, behind the laboratory director's desk, lay an unaccounted-for cassette tape. It was unlabeled, packed in a sealed bag, as if someone wanted to hide it from prying eyes forever. Inside, on a piece of yellowed tracing paper, was written a single word: finale. Playing the recording was a turning point, after which hypotheses finally gave way to chilling certainty. At first, the familiar voice of the Phoenix 5 operator was heard, but it was distorted, devoid of its usual intonations, drawn out and mechanical, as if it were being reproduced not by a human being, but by a complex, soulless instrument. We have become its food. It feeds on memory. Tell my daughter. Volkova froze. The air seemed to leave her lungs. The voice on the recording paused, and in that pause only a soft crackling could be heard, like the rustling of leaves or the quiet burning of that very cold fire. And then something poured out of the speakers that made the blood run cold in the veins of the entire team listening to the recording. The voice, still carrying echoes of the operator's timbre, began to recount Volkov's personal, intimate memories. It recounted her 6th birthday, how she broke her knee chasing a lizard at the dacha, an incident she herself had almost forgotten, and certainly never told anyone about. It described the scent of her mother's perfume and the pattern on the curtains in her childhood bedroom. These were not just facts, they were fragments of her soul, reproduced with dispassionate photographic accuracy. Anna, the camerawoman, could not possibly have known these things. It was proof that the anomaly had penetrated beyond the firefighters' consciousness. It had reached their deepest, most protected thoughts, and was now using them as its vocabulary. This discovery was stunning in itself, but the next piece of the puzzle came from outside, from the present. Volkova, realizing that she was dealing with a phenomenon capable of radio transmission, hired an elderly radio enthusiast known for his work with numbered radio station archives and other airwave anomalies as a consultant. He was not privy to all the details, working blindly with only the frequencies once used by the Vega object. A few days later, an encrypted message arrived on his personal server. The radio operator recorded a strange, constantly repeating signal in the shortwave range. Its source was in the same area of the taiga. Initially, it was just digital noise, but after applying specialized filters, a voice emerged. It was the same voice from the last communication session of Phoenix 5, but it was not the original stored in the archives. It was a distorted copy, an echo that had passed through the prism of the anomaly. The phrase, "We see fire, but it is not burning," sounded the same, but immediately after it, in the very pause where there was only noise in the original, a new, clear voice was now heard. A child's voice, singing a fragment of the very lullaby mentioned in the cameraman's journal. And then, at the end of the recording, where there should have been silence, the same mechanical version of Anna's voice, as on the tape said, "The light wants to know if you remember the smell of almonds in the old cupboard." Volkova remembered. It was a cupboard in her grandmother's house that she used to climb into as a child, and that smell of old wood and dusty almonds was unique, existing only in her memory. Now, it was part of this echo. The anomaly didn't just swallow the squad. It established a direct, one-way connection with her, Volkova. It responded to her silent investigation, using her own past against her. It went beyond the forest and the bunker. It was in the air. It knew her. It conducted its own incomprehensible dialogue, in which people were only a source of raw materials, voices, images, memories. The truth was not only that her father and his team had become food for the entity. The truth was that the entity itself now showed a personal, almost intimate interest in her. Systematizing the data found in the bunker led Volkov to the only logical, albeit almost fantastical, conclusion. The key to understanding the nature of the anomaly lay in its origin. The laboratory journals provided invaluable raw data, but they lacked the context of decisions, motivations, and the human factor that turned scientific curiosity into tragedy. To find it, she had to find people. And after months of painstaking archival research, interviews with former military personnel and retired scientists, she managed to track down a man whose name was only briefly mentioned in the lists of the first wave of personnel, the father of Anna herself, the communications operator of the missing squad. He lived thousands of kilometers away from those places, in a small house on the outskirts of town that seemed frozen in time. a former military engineer and now a frail old man with eyes that reflected an inexhaustible weariness. He initially refused to talk. But the mention of his daughter's name, that very cassette with her voice, was the key that broke the lock on his silence. He didn't ask for money or demand guarantees of safety. It seemed he needed only one thing: to confess. Their conversation took place in his office, littered with books on quantum mechanics and biology. He spoke quietly, monotonously, his words devoid of emotion, as if he had rehearsed them long ago, waiting for this day. "You're wrong if you think we were villains," he began. "In the 70s, the world was different. We looked to the future with the belief that science could harness nature itself. The Vega project was one such project. Officially, it was a study of methods of influencing the biosphere. But our real goal was much more ambitious." He said that initially, the research did indeed concern bioluminescence, but very soon, scientists discovered that strain 7G had unique piezoelectric and neurotropic properties. Its mycelium, penetrating the substrate, could generate weak electromagnetic fields in response to mechanical pressure, sound vibrations, and, as it soon turned out, the bioelectrical activity of living organisms. "We called it resonance," the old man continued, staring at the wall as if he could see the past in it. "The fungus was not just a plant. It was a complex organic antenna capable of reading patterns of neural impulses. At first, they were the simplest ones: the fear of a test rabbit, the excitement of a dog. We thought we had found the key to telepathy, to a direct brain-computer interface. We dreamed of a revolution in communications, in the treatment of nervous diseases. But the revolution turned into a nightmare. The fungus didn't just read impulses, it absorbed, memorized, and reproduced them. Under controlled conditions, it looked like a scientific miracle. But when the experiments went beyond the laboratories and colonies of fungus were planted in open ground to test their survivability, something unexpected happened. The organism mutated. It began to grow at an exponential rate, forming vast underground networks. Its resonance intensified. It began to read not only momentary emotions, but also the deeper layers of memory, the very foundations of personality. It devoured not thoughts, the old man's voice faltered. It devoured the soul, consciousness, everything that makes a person human. We received the first reports of strange sounds in the forest, of voices, of animals behaving like zombies. We realized that we had created a monster that feeds on the very essence of the mind. But it was impossible to admit it. The project was too secret, too expensive. In 1981, a decision was made to conserve it urgently. They tried to destroy the colonies by dousing them with kerosene and setting them on fire. But the fungus, which fed on heat and electromagnetic fields, only mutated further, developing that very cold bioluminescence, a protective mechanism that mimics fire but without its destructive power, only with the lure of light. We thought we had isolated it. The old man shook his head. We thought it would die without nourishment, but it found a way to feed on the memory of the entire forest. Insects, birds, animals, and then your father came with his team. He looked straight at Volkov. His eyes were hollow. They weren't victims to him. They were a feast. 5 highly developed, complex minds full of vivid memories and powerful emotions. He didn't kill them. He assimilated them. He absorbed them like a sponge absorbs water. Their voices, their knowledge, their love, their fears, all of that is now part of him. What you hear on the airwaves are not ghosts. They are echoes, a psychic trail that he does not reproduce, but constantly relives. They have become his nervous system. Anna, my girl, she's still there, trapped in this network. She and all the others. They're not dead. They've become fuel for something that has no beginning and no end. Volkova listened, and the world around her collapsed, taking on new, monstrous shapes. There was no hope of salvation. There were no bodies to bury. There was only an endless, insatiable entity using her father's mind, his people, her own memories as building blocks for its incomprehensible architecture. Justice was a meaningless concept. Her father was not dead. He had become an eternal prisoner in a labyrinth without walls, in a web woven from his own mind. The realization came not as a flash of insight, but as a slow, inexorable settling of heaviness at the bottom of her mind. All the hypotheses, all the hopes, all the versions she had built up over the years crumbled to dust, giving way to a monstrous, irrefutable truth. Her father, Anna, the entire Phoenix 5 team, they were not dead. Physical death would have been a merciful outcome, an act of closure. What had happened to them was infinitely worse. Their consciousness, the very essence of their I, had been absorbed, broken down into atoms of memory, and reprocessed into fuel for an incomprehensible organism. They had become neural patterns in a foreign nervous system, an archive of sensations and voices that the anomaly accessed like a library. They were not dead. They were preserved in an eternal now, in an endless cycle of reproduction, deprived of will, body, and future. The truth brought no relief. It brought only a quiet, all-consuming despair, colder than the coldest flame. This truth left no room for revenge, destruction, or salvation. How could one take revenge on an ecosystem? How could one destroy life that was the very earth, air, and trees? How could one save someone whose self had already dissolved into someone else's metabolism? Any attempts at physical intervention would be pointless and probably deadly. The anomaly was not an enemy. It was a phenomenon of nature, albeit a terrifying one, incomprehensible in its purposes. Justice turned out to be an illusion, a man-made concept with no power outside the human world. And it was this realization that led Volkov to the only possible, bitter, and heartbreaking decision. She returned to the bunker alone, without equipment, without samplers, without weapons. Her mission had changed. She was no longer a researcher or a vengeful daughter. She had become a guardian of memories that could not truly be buried. She walked through the familiar, cold corridors to the command center, where the same shortwave transmitter still stood. Dust hung in the beam of her flashlight, as if time had finally stopped in this place. She sat down in front of the device, her fingers slowly checking the settings. The emergency power source, which had lasted for decades, still provided a faint glow to the lamps. She was not going to transmit a complex message. There were no words that could express anything. She simply turned the transmitter on to continuous broadcast. It did not emit any modulated information, only a pure, unmodulated carrier frequency, a quiet, steady hum in the airwaves. It was not a signal, a call, or an attempt at communication. It was a bridge. One side of the bridge was here, in the world of the living, in a world where time and the future still existed. The other was in the frozen, eternal there, in the reality where the echoes of her father and his crew were locked away. And then, as if in response to this silent presence, a sound came from the speakers on the table, which were not connected to the network. At first, it was just a rustle, the same one that was on the tape. Then, voices emerged. Fragments of that last communication session, phrases from laboratory journals, excerpts from a lullaby. But now, new sounds were added to them. Whispers in which she could make out her father's voice saying her childhood nickname. Anna's laughter, but distorted, stretched out, as if in slow motion. And through this cacophony of other people's lives, her own memories came through, the very ones that the anomaly had pulled from her mind. Her own childhood laughter, the sound of a broken cup, her mother's whisper. It all mixed into a bizarre, endlessly repeating chorale, a symphony of absorbed consciousnesses. She sat and listened, unable to move. There was no fear, only endless, all-consuming sadness. She realized that this was their eternity, not peace, not oblivion, but a meaningless, contoutless quotation of themselves. They had become a song that nature had decided to repeat over and over again without understanding its meaning. A few hours later, she got up and left the bunker. She left the transmitter on. It continued to hum in the silence. Its signal, a beacon pointing not to salvation, but to a place of eternal imprisonment. She did not look back. There was no need. She carried that echo within her. The truth was clear, and it did not set her free. Nature had spawned a mind-consuming anomaly, and there was no malice in it, only blind, indifferent efficiency. There was no justice. There was no hope. There was only a quiet, endless echo, doomed to repeat fragments of other people's lives forever until the last listener turned to dust. And the transmitter would continue to hum, like a tombstone without a grave, the only witness that someone had once been here, whose mind had become a light that listens and a voice that has nothing to say.